you remember on Sunday, and of course I know you all remember exactly what I taught on Sunday, right? So if you remember on Sunday, I kind of gave you an intro to apologetics, you know, the Christian theological school of study that makes a defense for the Christian claims. For example, the reliability of the Bible, proof of the resurrection, arguments for the existence of God, those kinds of things. And we talked about how we have to be prepared to minister at various levels. Some people need an intellectual response. Their problem with God is, well, if God is so good, why does he allow so much evil and suffering? And we can give good logical answers for those questions and those criticisms. You know, some people just need a hug. Some people just need a lot of compassion. They need to be listened to, right? And you may meet a few from time to time that they know they're wrong with God, they know they're sinners, and they just need the gospel, right? Simply put. And so we talked about that last week, and then I gave you an example of how I like to use illustrations and questions to answer some of the difficult questions I chose out of many topics I could have chosen, the subject of hell, and we dealt with that for a few minutes. But tonight, I want to specifically do something to do with the problem of evil and suffering that's in the world. It's one of those topics. In fact, it's the number one reason why critics or skeptics say they reject God, is because of all the evil and suffering in the world. So as Christians, we really do need to have a good working knowledge of how to answer these difficult questions. Okay? Number one, we need a good understanding of what the scripture says and how God is in these situations, because there's many times we have to minister and comfort Christians, our brothers and sisters, who might be going through a very difficult time. And of course, we need to know enough about it because of what we may go through. If you haven't been through a difficult time or a serious crisis in your life, well, there's probably one coming. And we need a good understanding of how God operates and what the scriptures say about this problem of evil and suffering. But also, it's really good to have God's perspective on this to really evangelize non-Christians. Like I said, it's one of the questions that typically comes up when you talk to a skeptic or a non-Christian about, you know, God's character and why does he allow so much evil and suffering in the world. Okay? And listen, there's a book. Last week I recommended a book and a website. So if you remember that website, there's a lot of good articles on the problem of evil and suffering. The website is called alwaysbeready.com, right? And I also recommended a great book on evangelism called Tactics by Greg Koukl. I believe his name is spelled Koukl, right? But here is a must-read book for all Christians, okay? All Christians need to read this book. In fact, it's a great book to even hand to a non-Christian if they're open to the Lord. But I think it deals with the problem of evil and suffering in the most comprehensive way. And it's by an author named Philip Yancey. That's Yancey. And it's called Where is God When It Hurts? Very good book. Must read for all Christians. And potentially a good book to hand to a non-Christian. And so that's called Where is God When It Hurts by Philip Yancey. Okay? Now, of course, philosophers refer to the evil and suffering in the world as the problem of evil and suffering, right? And why do they call it the problem, right? Well, when you read the news and you see what's going on in the world, there is a lot of evil and suffering in the world. We can't avoid the topic. As Christians, we have to have a good understanding of where God is on all this, and also be able to respond with honesty and compassion and humility. Those are a necessity. Okay? Now, the problem is many times we misunderstand whose problem it really is. Okay? Number one, why is it a problem, and whose problem is it? right? Because the reality is the problem of evil and suffering is our problem. It's interesting because it's supposedly the number one reason why skeptics reject God. But, I've talked to a few atheists over the years, and they bring this subject up, and I always ask them, well, wait a second. If we're just glorified animals, then we should be killing each other. That's what animals do. And so all the evil and suffering in the world is just survival of the fittest. So I don't understand why you have a problem with it. That's how animals behave, right? And so it's not really the atheist's problem, it's our problem. And the reason why it's our problem is because we hold strongly to the fact that God is a good, loving, and all-powerful God. And so it's an honest question. If your God is so loving and so good and so powerful, why does he allow such a mess on this earth? Why so much suffering? Why so much poverty and starvation? Why do dictators get away with what they get away with? Right? And this is a very good question, right? And it's one of those things that, among other issues, that we have to put some serious thought into. In fact, C.S. Lewis, he wrote a book or an article called A Grief Observed. And it was actually after his wife had died of bone cancer. And this is what he writes about God. Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, if you turn to him, then with praise, you will be welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. Right? And that was C.S. Lewis's experience. As he was struggling with the death of his wife, he experienced the silence of God. And maybe you've experienced that. I know I've experienced it. I'm sure you've experienced it, where there's times where you're in desperate need and you're wondering what God is doing in this situation, and it's quiet. God isn't speaking. In fact, the problem of evil and suffering, there's a Christian writer named Peter de Vries. He wrote this in regards to the problem of pain and suffering in the world. It's the question mark turned like a fishhook in the human heart. Right? And I think as Christians, it's very important that we're honest about this, that, there is real suffering and pain in the world. And we need good answers to explain to people why God allows it. And so we see the problem of even suffering can create this real confusing message about God. But I think many times also there's a confusing message from the church. Not only is it a confusing message about God many times, but also it seems like the church doesn't get it right. We many times are very confusing about how we respond to the problem of evil and suffering in people's lives. I think, and it's been my experience, and hence why I've spent so much time studying this, is that it seems like most of the Western church, which generally enjoys lots of comfort, it's persecution-free, most of the Western church is quite ill-equipped to handle the subject. And in many cases, we can be quite unhelpful to people who are struggling. Much of the church just doesn't have a right view on suffering. Some of the church says, well, if you just have enough faith, you won't suffer. That's suffering and being ill and going through difficult times. That's not God's will for your life. It's just, you just need enough faith. Have you ever heard that? Some people come across as, well, God is displeased with you. There's something wrong with your life. And this is just a form of punishment. He must be displeased with you. There must be some sin in your life. Some people approach suffering that way. God must be punishing you. And some take a very high road and some very super spiritual position where you are God's chosen servant. You're in an honor position to suffer for Christ. And listen, when you've just been diagnosed with cancer, or someone very special to you has died, or something like that, Do you really need to hear someone say, you're just in the honored position to suffer for Christ? Do you really need to hear that? In fact, I remember I was going through a very difficult time, and a Christian, a lovely brother, don't get me wrong, a Christian goes, well, Romans 8:28, for all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And I said to him, I really didn't need to hear that right now. I just needed you to listen and give me a hug and have a bit of compassion. Sometimes we can be quite insensitive with our responses, and I think it's very important that we get this right. Because listen to what God said to Job's friends who did not get it right. This is Job chapter 42, verse 7. The Lord said to Eliphaz, my wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right. And so I think it's very important that we have a very healthy and biblical perspective on the problem of evil and suffering in the world. And I think there's a number of ways that we need to be prepared to minister in regards to this subject. We're going to focus on number 3 tonight. But I think there's 3 ways we really need to be strengthened and understand how to minister. Number 1, we need to be able to answer the question of the problem of evil and suffering theologically. What does the Bible actually really say about suffering? What does the Bible actually say about its causes, its purpose, right? Are we representing God correctly? Are we ministering biblically? So we need to be able to respond to the problem of evil and suffering theologically. What does the Bible actually say? But we also, I think, we need to be able to answer skeptics' questions philosophically, right? Just like we read that verse out of 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 last Sunday. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that is in you. We need to be able to give evidence. We need to be able to give a reasonable response to people who ask us about this problem of evil and suffering. Okay? We need to be able to use logic and reason to give good responses to it. But, to be honest with you, in my experience, yes, it's good to have the theological answers. I think it's very important, especially for us as believers. It's very good to be able to respond to this issue, this topic, philosophically using logic. But most people that I experience personally, as I talk to skeptics and unbelievers, or even Christians who are wrestling with God and why he allows evil and suffering, it's not a theological issue, it's not a philosophical issue, it's an emotional issue. They're just mad at God, or they're upset, they're hurting. And I think it's very important that we understand that for most people, this issue is an emotional issue. Okay? I was telling I was telling Julie and Jenny and Dave a story on the Zoom call, on the Zoom meeting after church last Sunday. And I remember, I love doing apologetics. I love talking to university students, or, making the case for God and answering their skeptical questions. And I was talking to this university student one time at Bath University, and he was talking about how we didn't need God. Evolution is, proven that we don't need God, and life can come through evolution and all this kind of stuff. And so we were, playing scripture, evidence table tennis. He was giving some evidence that he thought he had, that I was giving evidence, and I was refuting his evidence, and we were going back and forth, and it just didn't seem to get anywhere. Well, anyways, I met with him for coffee after that. I got his number, and we got together, and I started realizing, well, let's just get to know him a little bit. And I realized, as I started asking some questions and getting to know a little bit more about his life, that actually his mom died when he was 11 years old of cancer. And he was just hurting. And the reason why he rejected God and used science as a cloak for that rejection is because he was just mad at God. And if I just understood that his issue was more emotional than evidence-based or, philosophical or even science, I could have ministered to him more effectively. And this is where we're going to focus tonight. We're really going to be talking about the emotional perspective, because I think that's where when we come across this issue with people, it's going to be in the realm of emotions. Okay? Now, I've asked you to turn to Job chapter 1. And I think it really helps us. We learn a lot if we look at this issue from Job's perspective, if we understand Job's perspective. All right, and so Job chapter 1, I just want to read a few sections of chapter 1 so we kind of get an understanding of what's going on. So let's read in Job chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the east. And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters and eat and drink with them. So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. And so the testimony here in Job is that he was blameless and upright. And not only that, he was a great priest. He was a great pastor. He was interceding in that priestly role with his kids. He took it very seriously, and he really wanted his kids to be right with God. And so he would intercede for them if after they had these feasts, just in case they cursed God. Maybe they were drinking too much or whatever, and they cursed God. He would make sacrifices and intercede for his kids. So we see very clearly, and we're going to, as we read in the next section of text, even God testifies of Job this way. God testifies that he was blameless and upright and holy, right? God brags about Job. So when we get into the story of Job, we know it's very clearly not about punishment. Job is not being punished, right? But let's read verse 6. Now we get a bit of heavenly perspective on what's going on in the story of Job. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, and one who fears God and shuns evil?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to his face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Right? Very interesting. So the sons of God, which are probably angels, have approached God, and Satan is with them. Very interesting. Satan has access to God. And that's another Bible study that we can talk about some other time. And God takes the initiative. And he says to Satan, or the Satan, which means the accuser, the adversary, and he says, "Hey, have you noticed Job, my servant Job? He's blameless, he's upright, he shuns evil, he fears God. He's just an all-around great guy." But Satan's response is really interesting. He says, "Yeah, but does he worship you? Is he dedicated to you for just no reason at all? I mean, you've blessed the work of his hands, you've blessed his household, you've protected him on every side, but you take all that away? God, you take all that away? If he loses everything, he'll curse you to your face." What is Satan actually saying here? He's not only criticizing Job. He's not only attacking Job, that Job's faith in God, Job's love for God is shallow, but he's also criticizing God. He's saying, God, you have to bribe your followers. If you don't bribe them and bless them and protect them, right? You're not worthy enough in yourself to be worshipped and adored. So you have to bribe your followers. This is a huge accusation of Satan. This is a really big question, right? But what happens? Satan goes out and he destroys all of everything that Job owns. All the cattle, all the sheep, all of his servants, everything's destroyed. His children, all of his sons and daughters are in the house, and a big wind comes, knocks down the house, and all of his children are killed. Job loses everything. And how does he react? We'll go to verse 20. Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. And again, we see the same thing in chapter 2. Satan comes back to God. God says, hey, have you seen my servant Job? He's blameless and upright, right? He shuns evil. He fears God. And Satan says, yeah, but if you let me touch his body, if you let his body get ill, he'll curse you. And again, God allows Satan to do that, and Job broke out in these very painful boils. And again, his response, we see there, his wife says, will you just curse God and die? And he says there in verse 10, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God? And shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And right? Now listen, this is a very interesting story. And we see a lot of horrible things going on. Right? And we have to understand that when we read the book of Job, Job does not know chapter 1 and 2. We have to remember this. Job has no idea of this conversation between the Satan and God. He has no idea that God has allowed this to happen and that God is in control. When we read chapter 3 through 37, Job we see him fluctuating. Like we see at the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, he's got such a great attitude. He's worshiping God, even though it's been so horrible, and he's praising God and he's trusting God. But when we get into chapter 3, he's cursing the day of his birth. And we read through chapter 3 through 37, we see this fluctuation. One moment he's praising God and trusting God. One moment he's cursing the day of his birth. And the next moment he's saying, God, I want justice. I want a courtroom experience with you. I have accusations for you, God. And he's angry with God. But we have to know that Job does not know what we've just read in chapter 1 and 2. Do you? Like when you're going through a difficult time, does God give you a Job chapter 1 and 2? Does he explain what's going on in the heavenlies? No. Many times we're ignorant. And we also have to see here, I think this is very important, God is not the source of the suffering, right? But he does allow certain things to happen. He allowed Satan to destroy Job's goods. He allowed Satan to cause illness on Job's body. But God is not the source of it. And I think it's also very important that keep in mind what we see Satan do to Job when God gives him the freedom to do it. Because we know Job couldn't have done this unless God had given him permission to do it. And so that makes it interesting to think. Look at Satan's reaction when God gave Satan a little bit of freedom. When God let go of his chain just a little bit. Look how much destruction he brought on Job's life. So it makes me wonder, what in the world is God protecting us from? I think we need to keep that in mind, that God must be protecting us from so much if this is what Satan's going to do as soon as he's given a slight bit of freedom. Right? But, when we look at chapter 1 and 2, Job seems to be handling it so well. It's ridiculously horrible what he's going through. He's lost his family. He's lost all of his wealth. He's ill, seriously ill, but he's praising God. But like I said, when we get into chapter 3 through 37, we see him going up and down. Many fluctuations in his emotions, right? And also, he's getting horrible counsel from his friends. He's getting horrible counsel from people. Turn to chapter 4, verse 7. Listen to what one of his friends says to Job. Look at what Eliphaz says to Job. In chapter 4, verse 7. Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? Even as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Right? So Eliphaz comes to Job and says, well, I'm sorry that you've lost all your family and all your goods and all your wealth. Sorry that you're destitute and you're feeling really horrible, really ill right now. But I just want to let you know that God's punishing you. You must have done something wrong. Because who suffers like this if they haven't committed sin? Right? Who ever perished being innocent? Or when were the upright ever cut off? Right? Thanks, Eliphaz. Good timing with your lovely encouragement. Right? So we have to keep this in mind. He's going through this really difficult time, a lot of emotions up and down. Right? He's struggling. He's getting bad counsel from the people around him. The people are misrepresenting God. And then, if you go to chapter 38, God actually finally shows up in Job chapter 38. Let's read chapter 38, verse 1 to 5 together. So keep in mind, Job's been accusing God. He's been asking God questions. God, I need an audience with you. I want the court. I want you in court now because I have some questions to ask you. Right? So God shows up in chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know, Job. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? Right? And so God comes out asking Job some questions. Job, when I created the universe and I made the earth, where were you? Where were you when I established all this and created all this? Created the fish and the sun and the stars and the seas. Where were you? Did you have any part to play in any of that? Did your power do that? Was your creativity or your wisdom involved in any of that? And I can imagine Job going, oh, I think it's time to be quiet, right? And it's very interesting. You read Job chapter 38 through 42, and God shows up, and Job is actually put on trial, right? And God, with authority and very lovingly, puts Job in his place. And he actually said, never answers the question of why it happened in the first place. He doesn't explain to Job, hey, by the way, Satan came in, we're having this conversation, and I allowed him to do what he did. Never explained any of the background. Never gave him any reasoning. Never answered the why question, right? But through all this questioning and giving Job understanding of God's authority and power, he says, Job, you just have to trust me. If I can create the universe and hold the universe together and create all the animals and hold the earth together, Job, don't you think I can take care of your life? Don't you think I have control and authority in your life as well? And so it's really helpful to understand Job's experience, right? And with that in mind, with Job's experience in mind, we need to see how important that is to us. Okay? What should be our attitude about ministering to someone who is suffering? What do we learn from Job's experience? Now, go back to Job chapter 2. Because I think when Job's friends showed up originally in Job chapter 2, verse 11, they actually started off really well. Okay, the problem is when they started to try to figure it out and answer the why question. That's when they got in trouble. But let's look at Job chapter 2, verse 11. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all his adversity that had Now when Job's 3 friends had heard all of his adversity that had come upon him, each one came from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, for they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they raised their eyes from afar, they did not recognize him. They lifted their voices and wept. And each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Now, listen, I want to give you some really important advice or biblical teaching on how it's best to minister to people who are suffering. Okay? And I think we can learn a lot from Job's experience. And the first thing we see here, and we learn from Job's friends, right, is, number 1, go and be quiet. Be a listener. Right? What happened when Job's friends heard about Job's suffering? They made an appointment together. They communicated with each other. They got together and they said, we all need to go to Job and just support him. And they went. And they traveled all the way to where Job lived, and they sat there for a whole week. They just sat with him on the ground. They mourned with him. They torn their clothes. They put ashes on their heads. But they didn't say anything. They were quiet. They were silent. And listen, this is the one thing that I think is very important for us as believers, whether we're ministering to Christians or non-Christians, in regards to suffering, their suffering. Go. Right? Get beyond those awkward barriers where, I don't know what to say, or maybe I should leave them alone. No, I don't want to talk about it. Most likely, 99% of the time, they want you there. They want to talk about it. But they don't need a sermon. They don't need you going in there preaching, because when it's awkward, many times when it's awkward, we don't know what to say. We just start saying stuff. Don't do that. Go there with the attitude, like Job's friends, be silent. Be a good listener. Let them be upset. So number 1, the first advice I can give you when you want to minister effectively to someone who's suffering, and from what we learned from Job's friends, number 1, go, but be silent. Be a good listener. The second thing that we need to be is safe. We need to be safe. Right? What do I mean by that? Listen, when we read through Job, we see Job goes through all these emotions. One moment he's praising God and he's trusting God. The next moment he's cursing the day he was born. He was wishing he was never born. He'd rather be dead. In other moments he was mad at God and he was accusing God of things. I have questions for you, God. And he was going up and down with all these emotions. And that could be really intimidating. That could be really scary when you see somebody angry with God. I've been there myself, personally. But listen, we need to be safe people. We need to let them be angry. We need to let them be upset. We need to let them be mad at God and not judge them and just comfort them. And we need to be safe listeners. They need to be comfortable and willing to express all their emotions around us. So the second thing we need to be is safe. We need to allow people to safely, in our presence, go through the range of emotions. And the next thing we need to be, number 3, is be reasonable. So we need to go and be good listeners. We need to be safe, and we need to be reasonable. Let me ask you a question. With everything horrible that Job went through, did God ever give him the why question? Did he ever answer the why question? Did God ever answer Job, Job, this is reason why you went through this? No. Here we have probably one of the earliest dated stories in Scripture, right? Most scholars believe that this is one of the earliest stories during the time of the patriarchs, maybe during the time of Abraham, okay? And it could have been one of the earliest settings, earliest stories, in a sense, one of the first books written. And what is the topic? God and the problem of evil and suffering. It's like, hey, listen, right from the beginning, God's saying, this is what I'm like. I may allow some of this stuff in your life. And, I'm not going to tell you the why. I'm not going to answer the why question. You're just going to have to trust me. You're just going to have to walk through this with me. And trust my power. Trust my wisdom. Trust my authority. Right? And so listen, if God never answered the why question, then neither should we. We shouldn't try to answer it either. Because they're probably going to be asking us, why is this happening? Have I done something wrong? Is God mad at me? Or maybe I just don't have enough faith. Who knows what they may be asking? And we just have to be honest and say, I don't know. I don't know why God's allowing you to go through this. But I know He loves you. So we need to be reasonable. We don't have to answer the why question. In fact, we probably 99.9% of the time won't know the answer to that question. Go to Luke 13. This is very interesting because even Jesus handled it this way. Luke chapter 13, verse 1. Very fascinating story. Keep your hand in Job because we'll be back there again. Luke chapter 13. Let's read verse 1. And this reads like headlines. We could be reading the newspaper. Luke chapter 13, verse 1. There were present at that season some who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And Jesus answered and said to them, do you suppose that these Galileans were worse sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered such things? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. And then he gives another headline, right? Or those 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell and killed them. Do you think that they were worse sinners than all the other men who dwelt in Jerusalem? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Right? So it's interesting. If people were coming to Jesus and they brought up two headlines. Oh, Jesus, did you hear about how Pilate murdered all those Galileans and he mixed their blood with the sacrifices? Why did God allow that? Were they worse sinners? And Jesus, reading their minds, he asks them, he's proactive. He goes, do you think they were worse sinners than other people's, that they suffered that way? No. Right? And then he brings up the story, that Tower of Siloam. It was another headline just a few days ago. When it fell over and it killed those 18 people? Do you think that they were worse sinners than other people in Jerusalem? Jesus says no. No. Notice he doesn't answer the why question. He doesn't answer the why question. But he gives this statement, says, unless you repent, you will likewise perish. He says, listen, when we look at the suffering and the struggle in the world and the death that we see in this world and the evil that we see in this world, he says to them, listen, you need to be prepared. You need to be ready to meet God. You need to repent and be ready to meet God because you never know. This world is full of suffering. It's full of death. It's full of evil. You could be next. Don't you want to be ready? But notice he doesn't answer the why question. A perfect opportunity to answer the why, doesn't go there. And so neither do we. So we've learned now from Job's experience, number one, Job's experience, we learned some things that I think are very important. Number one, go to them and be a listener. Right? Two, be safe. Don't judge them. Let them go through all the emotions. Let them be mad at God. Be safe. And also be reasonable. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to be there to comfort them and listen to them and hug them. Right? But now, what about God's perspective on this? What can we learn from God's experience? Now, I find this very interesting, and this is what separates Christianity from most other religions, is that actually God himself suffered, right? God himself wasn't immune to suffering. People criticize God. Why does he allow this? Why does he allow all this evil? Why does he allow that dictator? But it's interesting. According to Bible history, God himself wasn't immune to suffering. He condescended himself. He came in human form, and he was mistreated. He was abused. He was lied about. He was betrayed. His friends left him. He felt abandoned by God. Have you ever felt abandoned by God? Jesus himself felt abandoned. He was physically abused. He was laughed at. He was scorned. Right? Go to Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. And I think this is very important. We've looked at Job's perspective and what we can learn from Job's experience. But let's see what we can learn from God's experience. In Mark chapter 14, look at verse 32. Then they came to a place which was named Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." He went a little further and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." We need to look at this and see something very powerful here. Two specific things we see. And I want to ask you the question, how did God react to suffering? Now this is very important because this is going to help us better minister to people who are suffering around us. How did God react to it? We see there a few times in Mark chapter 14, verse 33. It says there in the middle of the verse that he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. He says in verse 34, he says to the disciples, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death." Right? How did God react to suffering? He was stressed. He was so stressed, we read in Luke that he sweated blood. That is a sign of serious stressing. When your capillaries, you're so stressed, your capillaries in your face are bursting and blood is coming through your pores. So now, the first thing we see, how did God react to suffering or the threat of suffering, is he was stressed. It stressed him out, right? But also, we see, if you look in verse 36, and he said, in the face of suffering, in the face of going to the cross, he says to God, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me." Right? And look back at the verse 35. And it says there in the middle of the verse, and he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. So not only was he stressed as he was facing all this suffering, but he also wanted to avoid it. He wanted to flee from it. He recoiled from it, right? He wasn't excited to go through it. He didn't like, oh, goody, I get to suffer now. Bring it on, Lord. In fact, make it even worse. No, he wanted to flee it. He didn't want to go through it. In the end, he just chose, out of obedience, to submit to God. But, number one, it stressed him out. And two, he didn't want to go through it. And I think that's very important. So what are God's thoughts towards people who suffer? Right? When we look at Mark chapter 14, or all the Gospels, when we look at the Garden of Gethsemane, we see God's experience with suffering. And this can help us understand how we should approach others who suffer. I mean, think about it. God himself was stressed when he was suffering. He wanted to flee from it. He didn't want to go through it. Can you relate to that? I could relate to that. And what does any loving parent feel when their child is suffering? They feel overwhelming compassion and concern for their child. And so when we suffer, or we minister to anyone who suffers, listen, I think it's very important that we get the message across to them that God understands it perfectly. God can relate. You know, when you read through the various Gospels and we see the suffering that he went through, anything that we go through, Jesus has been through even worse. Right? And that's the power of the gospel. That's the power of the God of the Bible, is that not only does he have all power and authority, and he's all wise, but he's also a God who suffered himself, and he has compassion. So, as we close, Lord, whoever the Lord may bring into our life that we may be ministering to, or maybe when we're going through something difficult ourselves, there's a few things we need to remember. Number one, right? Some practical tips on how best to minister to someone who's suffering. Number one, go and be a good listener. Number two, be safe. Don't judge them for all the emotions they're going through. Maybe they're going to be angry with God. Be a safe person. Allow them to go through all those emotions, to experience all those emotions. Right? 3, you don't need to answer the why question. Right? God doesn't even bother to answer the why question, so how can we? So don't feel the pressure to go in there and have all the answers. You don't need to. Right? It's okay to say, I don't know. But number 4, we can direct them to the fact that God totally understands. Remind them that God understands. God has been through suffering as well. And you're not enjoying this. This is stressing you out. You want to get away from it. You want to get out from under this suffering. You want to get to the other side. God wanted to do the same thing. He completely understands what it means to suffer. And so those are 4 very important things that we learn from Job's experience and also God's experience to be a better minister to someone who's going through a difficult time. And listen, this is something that I think is very important. Many times we have a short-term view or short-term understanding of ministering to people who've gone through a very difficult thing. Can we try to have a long-term view? Maybe after a couple months, people stop visiting someone who's maybe lost a loved one or been diagnosed with cancer. Maybe they stop coming after a month or 2. Or maybe, they stop bringing meals. But listen, we need to have a long-term plan as well. We need to let them talk about it. Especially if somebody's lost, like a parent has lost a child. People I know that have lost a child, they say it takes them 10 years just to get back to normal life. So we need to have a long-term plan. We need to have a long-term view on compassion and be willing to listen in the long term.